in practice, when you've selected your algorithms, I just threw a bunch of different algorithms at you. You're going to have to figure out how good did your algorithm do. We can look at it and qualitatively say it did good or bad, but most of your data is going to be in very high dimensions, and it's a little hard to tell if it did good or bad. And so on the regression side of things, when you're predicting a continuous variable, there's several metrics that you can use. One of them is the mean squared error or the mean square root error, RMSE. Both of these are pretty much the same thing. RMSE is just the square root of the MSE. And it's just this formula. It may look scary, but it's not that complicated. It's just saying that the squared error of every point. So you predicted here, and it was actually here. So we're going to draw a line between them, and the distance is your error, and we add that up for every point. And then we divide by the number of samples to get an average. We have the R squared, which looks like this, and this is often used in the linear regression case, and it ultimately is just saying from the mean, how bad are you doing? So it's very similar to MSE, but it's about the residual difference from the mean line versus the absolute difference from every sample. It's mostly used in linear regression. So, on the classification side of things, there's a whole slew of different metrics characterized by this Wikipedia page, and ultimately they all boil down to these four boxes in this matrix: the true positive, the true negative, the false negative, and the false positive. Being that you predicted something to be positive, but it was actually positive, or it was actually negative, and vice versa. So different fields will value different types of error more or less than others, and I'll kind of explain this more on the next slide. With in terms of this classification problem for binary classification, this receiver operating characteristic is heavily valued. So this is the matrix that I was just talking about before. You have your true positive, false negative, true negative, and you can draw this distribution with this. So the decision boundary of the classification problem is this line. And basically, your true samples, like your true negative samples, are over here. Your true positive samples are over here. And depending on how specific and good your model is at predicting these things, the variance on those will be different. And maybe, a perfect classifier, these distributions would be completely separate, and you would have no false positives or negatives. But in the real world, usually you have this trade-off. And the whole idea of the receiver operating characteristic is you can actually tune this boundary to trade off false negative samples for false positive samples, or vice versa. So you can make sure that your classifier, you can be like confident that it will only make so many errors of a certain type, if you like. And that's what these ROC curves are all about, that you will see often in papers that deal with classifiers. They're ultimately showing the true positive rate by the false positive rate, and they show essentially, if you move this line across the distribution, how it will look at each point along that line. And so you typically want these to spike up near the beginning and then trail off to the end. So this blue one over here is pretty good, whereas The one at the bottom is closer to random, and a line straight down the middle would be completely random. If it's below, something is weird because it means your model is better at predicting the wrong answer than the right answer, better than random. So that's a problem. Then your PR curve is similar to the ROC curve, but it's different metrics here. So it's the precision and the recall, which are kind of, with these two curves, you can get a pretty good sense of it. This particular curve will often look very different when you have class imbalances. So if your class imbalance is very bad, the ROC curve is like the optimistic estimate, as if the true distribution was 50-50. But if the true expectation is not 50-50, it can look like it's better than it is. Yeah, okay. So moving on, besides the ROC curves, whenever you want to train a model, you definitely need to make sure that it's going to generalize to unseen data. And the way this is done in practice is with this randomized shuffle split methodology and cross-validation. So the shuffling and splitting involves taking your original data set and then picking an arbitrary cutoff where you're going to take this test data and keep it out so that your model does not see it, and you can use it for benchmarking. Because if you try and ask what the performance is on data that your model has seen, it's just cheating. It can just memorize whatever you gave it. With enough parameters, most of these models have many parameters. They can easily memorize all of your data. So you definitely need to test it on data that's not been shown to the model. And so typically you want to hold out some test data for the final evaluation. And in the middle, you actually want to use some of that data for training a model and some of it that it's never seen before to test how that model did. So you're going to do this, and this is so-called k-fold cross-validation with 5 folds. And so you can kind of see that the green, you train one model with the green and you test it on this segment. You train another model on these green, you test on that segment, right? So you basically work your way through the whole data set and train your model on the different data to predict things it's never seen before. And through this process, you're going to find out what your model, if your model is, first of all, working and able to extrapolate, and second of all, what holds regardless of how you fold it. And through this method, you can find kind of good parameters to use for your model, since a lot of models need these so-called hyperparameters to determine various constants in the equations. And once you've done that, you finally have to just test it on this data you never used before at all. The model has never seen. It wasn't used to tune the model at all. That's how you test it. And when you make a paper, they expect it to be tested there on that thing. And another thing to mention, just there's something called stratified splitting. And by stratifying, if you have a class imbalance, you preserve it when you make the split. So if you had 9 items of one class and only 1 of the other class in your original data set, when you do a stratified split in each of your folds, you're going to have 9-to-1 ratios. Alternatively, you just do a random one and just hope for the best that you get it. If it's sufficiently random and you have enough data, it will work. But stratified will make sure that you preserve those class imbalances. Finally, we have, like, in practice, a lot of these diagrams that I showed you were straight from scikit-learn. This is a Python package for machine learning, and it's a bit of a one-stop shop, if you will, for a wide variety of different machine learning models. And it encompasses all these different aspects that I've talked about, from classification, regression, clustering, dimensionality reduction, and even some ETL helpers. And they have very good docs that you can review for each of them. They tell you the assumptions of those models. They give you example code, and also have all these, as you saw, demonstrations of how the different algorithms differ from each other. So to conclude the lecture part, and then I'll go on to the practicum. We talked about just the broad definitions of AI, machine learning, and deep learning. We talked about supervised versus unsupervised, semi-supervised, and also reinforcement learning. We talked about regression, binary, multi-class, and multi-label classification problems. We talked about these classes of models, linear models, dimensionality reduction, clustering, and decision trees. And then we talked about some of these impractical steps for actually performing machine learning on a problem, from normalization, regression, and various benchmarking metrics, cross-validation,